The talk is What's Your Street Race? Ontological Contests, Inverted Epistemologies, Statistical Gaslighting, and the Data Racial Contract in the 2020 Census and the 2024 Office of Management and Budget Revised Race and Ethnicity Standards. I want to just, repeat that this work and this presentation are my analysis and don't represent that of the funders or my employer. And instead of reading an Indigenous land acknowledgement, I just want us to critically reflect on what our praxis is. What is our praxis around being in solidarity and acting in solidarity with Indigenous nations? So these are just some of the works that Dr. Hancock referenced, and I always like to show visuals. But one thing I want you to keep in mind, all of this work uses intersectionality as a normative principle for inquiry into inequities. So I wanted to just pose a couple of questions. How can we understand the adoption of a combined question in the 2024 OMB standards recently? This happened in March. What explains the absence of social scientific research on inequities to inform these decisions? How did two or more become the second largest group in the 2020 census? And what is the impact of these changes for examining outcomes for Latinx communities and beyond, right? And how could we imagine engaging some freedom dreaming, right? A future where intersectionality as inquiry and praxis advance new transformational knowledge and a generative vision for race, ethnicity, and other data collection for equity-minded research. So hopefully we will think about our theory of change, because this is very much about praxis, and also think about your spheres of influence. In the chat, if you have an opportunity, I want you to add to these values. I always like to start with what are our values for reporting data and analysis. And I'll highlight a couple that are particularly important for me. Attention to power dynamics, do no harm. Indigenous data sovereignty, and thinking about the harm that's been done when that has not been practiced. Commitment to critical self-reflexivity and intersectionality, of course. I argue that this is the time for us to adopt a transformational approach that includes intersectionality, right, as a normative principle in our data collection at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, in any organization that cares about data use for equity-minded policy. So in the chat, I want you to also jot down what ideas, concepts, or images come to mind when you hear the word intersectionality. Here is one definition of intersectionality that I often use, and it comes from Collins and Bilge, and it simply says that intersectionality investigates how intersecting power relations influence social relations across diverse societies, as well as individual experiences in everyday life. It's an analytic tool that views categories of race, class, gender, sexuality, nation, ability, ethnicity, age, among others, as interrelated and mutually shaping one another. It's a way of understanding and explaining complexity. However, there's a lot of misconceptions about intersectionality, and I use this one example. About a decade ago, I sent an email to a program officer at a funding agency, and his response to me was, intersectionality is a stand-in for analytical laziness. Perhaps a better way would be to focus on race, gender, or class, and continue to describe that, imply that intersectionality doesn't care about poor white people. I want everyone to take one thing away from this conversation, which is intersectionality is a social justice project, knowledge project, right? With inquiry and praxis for everyone, right? It applies to everyone. It is about equity for everyone. Of course, there's a huge, long genealogy, and thank you, Dr. Hancock, for your gift of your book on intersectionality and intellectual history. But we know that the term was coined by Crenshaw in the late 80s, but there's a long legacy of numerous scholars, practitioners, mostly Black women, but also other women of color that were engaged in this knowledge production, among others. So here's another visual that I often use that comes from Black feminist thought by Patricia Hill Collins. And it again illustrates the power of using these analytical tools, not only for data collection, but for any kind of other inquiry. The first part of the matrix, and I'm sure all of you are very familiar, talks about the importance of understanding history, place, context, right? And what constellation, what configuration of inequities, intersectional inequities have existed, are present, and what might be in the future when we look at a place like New York City, where I was born, or New Mexico, Albuquerque, where I live now, or if we go to Brazil or South Africa or Germany, right? So that we can do a deeper dive, we would also try to understand what is the structural domain of power? What are the organizational arrangements? What are the rules of the game, the disciplinary domain of power? And what are the individual lived experiences, the interpersonal domain of power, the agency? But also, what are those controlling images? What are those narratives of identity, of controlling images about who deserves access to education or not, or what is the cause of high mortality rates in particular communities? Those are also important for us to understand. But I want you to think about how you would use this as a tool for mapping the inequities, the intersectional inequities that exist in your neck of the woods. So for the next couple of slides, I'll just show some empirical examples, and then we'll do our deep dive into what's happening in federal data collection. So this comes from a special issue of Race, Ethnicity, and Education. And it was a quantitative, quant-crit special issue that looked at the odds of graduating at a public university that will remain nameless in the Southwest, according to IRB institutional review protocols. And what it does is show the value of looking at race, gender, and in this case, income as a category of experience, a simultaneous category of experience. And the reason I highlighted all of the social locations in red was that these are all low income. And look at the disparities that become visible. So we look at the odds of graduating for low income Indigenous men and women, 45% less likely to graduate than high income white women. And I want to also point out that we chose to contextualize this data by saying we're going to look at only graduates from a high school in the state. That was 80% of the analytic sample. So again, a radical contextualization that would say settler colonialism has a lot to do with this. Now, you can see that the range goes from about 14% less likely to 45% less likely. Again, this is a way of making the invisible visible. This is not looking at odds of graduating. This is cohort graduation rates, and this is at the University of New Mexico. And this is just another application that illuminates another configuration of inequality. So all of the yellow highlighted are all first generation college, like myself, students. I want you to notice that because this institution conflated race and ethnicity, we cannot tell if this is the outcome for Black Latinas, Indigenous Latinas, Brown Latinas, White Latinas, Mestiza. But you see that there's dramatic differences that again become visible. And one of the things I want to underscore is that this inquiry was tied to praxis. So one of the things we did here in New Mexico was introduce a statewide bill to collect parent level of education from preschool to grad school. It did not pass, but we're hoping to reintroduce it at some point. But again, always prepare for resistance. What if someone says, hey, that's impolite, we already have too many questions. And by the way, zip code is a proxy for looking at class. How are you going to prepare for the resistance, right? This is just a tool I use in my intersectionality, race, class, gender, social policy hybrid class that includes both undergrads and grads, to have them choose a policy of their choice. In this case, we're looking at using Pell as a status for quote unquote at risk, and recognizing that that's very limited, and what intersectional alternatives could exist that would actually use parent level of education, race, gender, ethnicity as an intersectional social location. All right, so now we'll switch gears, and for the rest of the talk, we are going to think about how this lens of intersectionality can help illuminate inequities that become invisible when we conflate race, which has a visual status, and ethnicity, which is about cultural heritage. So I want you to think about this. Can one question capture all of these concepts? think about it. Would you ask about gender and sexuality in one question, or income and educational attainment and wealth in one question? Well, let's think about what the implications are, right? Race, ethnicity, origin, tribal affiliation, community attachment. What are the key defining features? What are the implicit conceptualizations, the ontologies, the theories of reality of what these things mean? What are the epistemological commitments? What are the ways in which, we can think about disaggregation? There is this effort to disaggregate, but there's never really an explicit attention to intersectionality as in creative praxis. And how could that be transformative for illuminating inequities? This is just a genealogy of sorts that comes from the national content test that the Census Bureau conducted in 2015. And it kind of maps, the changing categories that have existed in data collection in the census from the 1700s until the present. And the question I often ask is, data for whom and for what, right? We know that under the racial dictatorship, and this comes right from Omi and Wenat racial formation in the United States, and under colorblind racism from Bonilla Silva, we have seen a decoupling of race and ethnicity data being used for civil rights outcomes and measurements to simply being about abstract liberal principles about individual self-identity, to the exclusion of race as a social status, right, that has a visual component. So I want you to think about Victor Ray's theory of racialized organizations, also Charles Mills, the racial contract, among many, many other theorists that could help us unpack, how these changes have occurred, racial formation, Omi and Wenat, etc. So some of the things I point out is that certainly we've seen changes in the categories, but how are these all implicated in ontologies or epistemologies of ignorance? So another visual that also comes from that national content test has a timeline of the OMB standards. And I want to clarify, the Office of Management and Budget since the 1970s tells every single federal agency, including the census, how they should collect race and ethnicity data. It doesn't apply to other organizations like universities or real estate agencies or hospitals, but many of those organizations default to this national standard. So one of the things that I want to just illustrate, so these standards were created in 1977, and they were revised at least twice after that in the 90s and now most recently. And, one thing to keep in mind is that the first time that not an enumerator, but you were able to self-identify your race on the census form was in 1970, just a year after I was born, right? And, since then, we have never, the word color disappeared. The question used to be, what is your race or color? And since the 1980s, there's been a decoupling of any of the testing that is happening about one question format versus the other from any social outcome, whether it is implications for apportionment, implications for voting, redistricting, or any other program analysis, etc. So we can look at this in terms of racial formation. We can look at this as a data racial contract. But the idea that now, the race data has kind of been decoupled from the goals, which is to understand how, if at all, discrimination is happening, civil rights are being compromised. So most of the testing, since this time has been simply on cognition, but not any structural or materiality to that identity, right? So here are two versions of the census questionnaire, the decennial census, right? Every 10 years, every household receives this. So I just want to contrast these two so that you can notice immediately some differences. First, for decades, we've had two separate questions. Is this person of Hispanic origin? And I would be able to mark, yes, I am Dominican. My husband, he is Chicano, not of immigrant background. This New Mexico was Mexico, right, until the 1880s. And so for race, I would be able to mark Black. Other members of my family who are very white, presenting would mark white, etc. Um, the census has never included any category like mestizo or brown or mestizo claro or anything like that, has never tested it, but in any case, some individuals would write it in the some other race. Now in 2020, I want you to notice the Hispanic origin question remained the same. However, there was a massive and major change that occurred that for the first time in the history of the census, the white and black categories had suggested origins in that write-in box. And look at the directions. It says mark one or more boxes and in highlight in bold, print an origin. So guess what would happen? If you marked I'm white and South African, that you would be I'm sorry, if you marked I am white and it did not concord with what the Office of Management and Budget declares is a so-called white origin, then you are automatically recoded into two or more. The same would be true if I marked black and I wrote in Dominican, I would be recoded into two or more. Two or more is not a civil rights protected origin. So again, why is this important? Because the argument that was given is we made this change because it's in harmony with the Office of Management and Budget, which defines racial categories in terms of geography, in terms of origin. And again, all of these changes have been happening across since the 1970s. It is interesting that in the original phrasing of the Office of Management and Budget guidelines, they are careful to define race as a social political construct that is not anthropologically or scientifically based. And I asked myself, well, what kind of science are they talking about? Social science? Because interestingly enough, in the revised 2024 guidelines, the word scientific disappears entirely. So what is the change? Now, all federal agencies, and again, I want to underscore this only applies to federal agencies, are required to use this format, which is basically conflating ethnicity and race into one question. The question will read, what is your race or ethnicity? So the other thing that was different is that now MENA, a Middle Eastern or North African category, was added, and that by default, all federal agencies should include checkboxes, right? Presumably with ethnicities or cultural origin. But I want us to think about how these definitions are part and parcel of what Omi and Wanat describe as racial formation or racial projects, definitions, interpretations, and representations of racial dynamics that are absolutely tied to the allocation of resources. And I name a few up there. And think about the social construction of knowledge. Think about Mill's racial contract, and we call it the data racial contract, that is conflating accuracy about self-identity versus accuracy that helps illuminate structural inequities, material inequities, right? And if previous studies in the 1980s showed that separate questions are better for the undercount for Hispanic communities in particular, why has there been such a push to test questionnaires without the word race and even no social outcome, right? Why did they not include other tests that would be meaningful and include categories that would be meaningful, especially for Latino communities? This is just a visual representation of racial projects. And again, we can think about these as changes that have implications for resources to communities that experience racialized poverty and other inequities in employment and so on. These racial projects not only occur at the Census Bureau at the level of social movements, but they're embedded in our institutions and they are also occurring at the individual level. Another thing I like to highlight from racial formation theory from Omi and Wanat is that they are very clear that race has a visual dimension, that corporeal distinctions are common, that include skin color, not exclusively, but are part of these definitions, physical build, hair texture, the structure of cheekbones, the shape of nose, etc. That there is a phenotypic association that happens, right, when we create racial categories. I want to point out that the Census Bureau, a month before they went into the field in 2020, did produce a Census Academy video that forecasted what they were about to do, which is to recode people without their knowledge into the two or more category. And it was interesting because I watched this, and you would see in the Q&A people saying, wait a minute, are you saying that people who would say I am white or I am black and just put in an origin that's not concordant is going to be recoded? And it was pretty powerful to see that there wasn't a good response, right? We know again why these data are used. They're used for apportionment, for voting redistricting, program delivery, assessing whether or not we've reduced poverty, etc. But again, with this conflation and this recoding that happened, it makes it very difficult to understand whether or not we've made a dent in all of these racialized inequities. And I want to signal Hansilo Wang, which is an amazing reporter at NPR, the National Public Radio. He was talking about how in Louisiana, there's actually a case, and I'm not clear what the decision has been since the case came forward, where for voting redistricting, they're deciding that if you marked black alone, you would count, and black and white, but no one else. So again, these decisions have real consequences on the ground. I also want to highlight the work that Dr. Ricardo Lowe, who's a postdoc at UT Austin and a member of our research team, has done in analyzing the American Community Survey responses and showing again that the recoding that has happened because the American Community Survey employed that wording that adopted origins next to race boxes has reduced in massive reductions, right, in Black Latino counts, but particularly Dominicans and Hondurans. This is a table from the 2010 census, not the 2020, that again shows that Latinos, there's this idea Latinos don't know their race and they're all marking some other race, but there's variation in that, right? 85% of Cubans in the United States identify as white, compared to half of Puerto Ricans and Mexicans. 30% of Dominicans, we have the lowest number of people identifying as white, as well as South American. Think about how an intersectional lens makes all of this visible and how those differences might map onto inequities. And I use this quote from Gina Garcia in her book, Transforming Hispanic Serving Institutions for Equity and Justice. And she's citing Haywood here, saying that it is very important for us to do that intersectional disaggregation that includes race and ethnicity. She writes, Afro-Latinos and indigenous Latinxes might have different commitments than white and mestizo Latinxes, as issues of race and racism, the coloniality of power in the United States more directly affect them on a daily basis. Black Latinx alumni may have had negative experiences, including social exclusion and racial discrimination from other Latinx. So again, being intersectional is about making the invisible visible. And I invite each of you to look at your institutional dashboard, whether it's at Ohio State or anywhere else, to see whether or not you can do intersectional analysis. How many Black, Latinx, women, non-binary students from any ethnic group, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Salvadorian, Dominican, Colombian, grew up in a household where no parent had a college degree and graduated compared to their cousins who are in a different social location? And I'll do a little spoiler. I've also been working with my colleague, Dr. Yasmin Irizarry and Edward Vargas, and our case studies of 30 nationally representative different types of organizations. I've only found one that allows for this, but there's even a caveat here. Even though they include first generation, we have no idea how they're defining that. This is wonderful work that I urge you to look at that does try to do some intersectional analysis. It's by Rogelio Sainz and Cristina Morales, and they basically look at the outcomes for Latinos, looking at the simultaneity of ethnicity in this case and nativity and gender. And so I want you to compare Mexicans and Colombians, and you'll see that there are major differences for US-born Mexican and Colombian women in education, where Colombians have much higher levels, right? An intersectional lens would look at the history, right, of Mexicans in the United States and Colombians, very different. And also, an intersectional lens would be highlighting questions that would look at the simultaneity of ethnicity and race. So the question would be, are US-born first-generation college Black Colombian women earning college degrees at the same rate as their white, brown, mestiza, etc. counterparts, and would dig even deeper and say, yeah, that might be an outcome, but what's their lived experience in the classroom, in the lab, in internships, in the workplace, while giving birth, right, etc. And I mentioned the incident in Univision, their reporter Ilia Calderon, who's a Black Colombian woman, and her experiencing Latinas coming to interview, and then when she shows up, her life is threatened because she's a Black Latina, right? So again, making visible these inequities only possible through intersectional analysis. There's a wonderful quote that again comes from my colega, Dr. Yasmin Irizarry and colleagues, that says, you know, what are the consequences of teaching, of treating Latino as a de facto racial category? In a combined question, it positions ethno-racial categories such as white, Native American, Asian, etc., and Black as being entirely separate and outside of what it means to be Latinx, which is at best ahistorical. That is something that's troubling. And I think it's important now to dig into the history. So this quote comes from Franklin Franco's work that talks about Black mulattoes and the Dominican nation, and it's quoting a governor in the 1800s that makes it very plain that race is a social construction. And it says, our population is made up of different colors and conditions. There are white people, there are dark-skinned people, there are Black people, and among these last two groups, there are free people and there are slaves. That doesn't mean that a slave is no longer a slave or that persons of color are suddenly on the level with white citizens. They all remain subject to the laws and responsibilities of their status, class, and position. That is something that again reminds us that Latinos have never been a monolith, not in Latin America and not here. I think we all know this case that came before Brown versus the Board of Ed. We need to revisit the Mendes versus Westminster. Sylvia Mendes and her cousins Alice and Virginia were going to be enrolled in a school in California by their, their family member, and they were told, Alice and Virginia, who obviously were not as dark-skinned or even Black presenting in the case of Sylvia, were told they could enroll, but not Sylvia, right? So Latinos have never been treated as a racial monolith. And to date, I'm doing work through funding from the W.T. Grant Foundation and the Hewlett Foundation that looks at the experiences of students participating in high school ethnic studies classes. And some of our teachers have told us that their brown-skinned Latino kids are being yelled at as they walk towards school and told to go back to where they came from. And some of them are being even threatened with people who are trying to run over them with their trucks. These are their brown skin, but we don't collect any data on that. We just assume that all Latinos are experiencing the same racial status, right? There's a saying in Spanish that you've probably heard, no se puede tapar el sol con un dedo, you can't cover the sun with a finger. Race and ethnicity are both social constructions. They have no genetic, biological, or innate component, but they're not equivalent. They're not concordant. We need separate questions. Ethnicity is a social position that refers to your cultural heritage status. Race is a social position in society that has a visual, ocular, and corporeal component. And this quote comes from my colleague, Howard Hogan, who retired from the Census Bureau as a demographer. And he says, if you don't know what you're asking, you don't know what you're measuring, any question is going to do. Why would it be useful to add an additional question, not just a self-identified question, but a question on street race? What is your street race? ¿Qué es tu raza o color en la calle? Why is this important? Because if we are assuming that we can collect origin and ethnicity and nationality and race as a visual social status in one question, we would make invisible these the inequities that all these Latinx men may experience when they show up in an ER presenting with the same symptoms or looking for an apartment. And so they have probably all had ancestors that were from all over the globe. They could all be Dominican, Colombian, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Mexican, but based on what they look like, they may have different experiences. So family members of the same ethnic group should answer the race question differently, right? And we should include an additional question on street race. So this is a visual that my husband actually created that looks at what is your street race. It was trying to invite artists to think and to create dialogues about what race is before the 2020 census so that people can reflect on the differences between race and ethnicity. And this measure, if you were out in public, what race do you think others would assume you are based on what you look like? And that would include skin color, facial features, etc. Mark only one. And if your response is I'm mixed, I'm ambiguous, think about in relation to whom. Think about other people who are also mixed, but are not, the word is ambiguous, right? So when we use this in national surveys that look at outcomes for Latinos, we published 2 articles, one in the sociology of race and ethnicity, as well as the critical public health. And we found major differences for men, women, etc., who were describing that they are not seen as white. Mara Jones has done this in the behavioral risk factor surveillance survey. She calls it the reactions to race module, which has several questions about experiencing unequal treatment when you access healthcare. And the question she asks is about what race do you think others would classify your race as? So it's basically getting at the idea that race is not simply about how you identify, that we also need that other measure, right? Which is how do you believe others see you? Others call it ascribed race, reflected race. I call it street race. It's just a way of making it more understandable that race is a relational social status, right? This other report was one that I co-authored with colleagues at the Urban Institute, and it was a well-being national survey that again demonstrates the utility of asking a street race question. And to my knowledge, and I hope that one of you can find another empirical studies that includes brown as a category. We found that 1 in 5 Latinos identify with that category, but when you take that away, most just say I'm Hispanic, which is really, again, conflating the experiences of white Hispanics, those that are brown but not black, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing you'll know is that when you ask any version of the street race question, whether we call it socially assigned or ascribed race, there's little variation for people who self-identify as white. There's there is some variation for those who identify as Black, where you will see a difference anywhere from 88 to 91% will say, yeah, others see me as Black. But for Latinos, Asians, and other groups, it varies tremendously. And again, these differences are not simply about identity. It is about differences in inequities, right? Lived experiences that become invisible when we conflate those two things, right? Narratives of identity with your race as a social status, a visual status. This is just a tool that I often use to help people think in ways that engage intersectionality and that recognize that we shouldn't be asking about tribal status and race in one question. They're analytically distinct, and ethnicity. Same is true for gender and sexuality. Same is true for disability status, partner status, etc. And also your educational attainment, your income, your wealth, those are all different. We absolutely need to do that. And we have to critically reflect on our location, right? In our institution's location and systems of inequity that, of course, we didn't create these systems. I didn't create colorism within the category of Black. And I often speak about my mom, an unambiguously Black and dark-skinned Black Latina immigrant woman who is often told that she looks so much like Celia Cruz or Michelle Obama. I recognize that my lived experience, even though I'm subjected to anti-Blackness, is also colorism is implicated in that. This is a tool that comes from Yuval Davis that is also useful for thinking about how we collect data. So not only do we need to collect data on our social status in these grids of power, as I mentioned earlier, or our narratives of identity, right? We also should think about our ethical and political commitments as not necessarily concordant. You can grow up in the same family, actually, have the same street race, but identify your narrative of identity in ways that are very different. And you may have very different values when it comes to voting, right? Or your ethical and political commitments. So also understanding that domains of belonging are analytically distinct. This is just a question that shows what critical reflexivity could look like. And this comes from someone who attended a talk on street race. And she says, as someone whose street race is white, but has a grandmother who's immigrated from Latin America, it made me think a lot about my own journey in understanding my relationship to race and ethnicity. Is something that I'm beginning to grapple with. It has caused a fair amount of discomfort as well as excitement. So this is, again, instead of saying, oh, I don't like this measure because it's implying that I'm not Latina because, visually I look white. She's someone who's embracing this solidarity by looking deeper and saying, I'm a little uncomfortable, but actually I want to learn more and hopefully practice solidarity with those who experience something different. This is just a way for us to think how these differences are not just academic, but they're real. This is autoethnographic reflections. I was born, in New York City in tenements, raised for the most part in public housing. When I was a teenager in college, like my early years of college, I started experiencing gallstones and was misdiagnosed for months, ended up in an ER, and was told that the reason why they didn't suspect that I had this was because, quote, I was not fat, fair, or 40. And then spring ahead to the early 2000s when I had two children. And for the first birth, my husband and I were continually told that we needed to go to the basement to fill out paternity papers, even though it was clear on all our paperwork that we were married. In the same hospital, I had a friend who was also Latina, but not Black. And, thought, oh, it must be because we have different last names. Also has a different last name. They didn't experience that, gave birth the exact same day that I did, coincidence. And just illustrating the different treatment. Also being told that one of my children had a condition because of a quote unquote African gene. So again, thinking about the racialized social determinants of health and how this might manifest in the lived experiences. I call it the racialized gender social determinants of health in my co-edited volume called Mapping Race, and how that accumulates across time, right? What that might mean, why we find that Black Latinas have birth outcomes that pretty much mirror those of Black women who are not Latina, right? And they're not good, right? But if we just assume that all Latinas are having the same racial experience in delivery and during pregnancy while Black, then we again make this invisible. This is not opinion, right? There's tons of work that shows there's a color line. It's meaningful. Voting rights, even being sentenced for crimes, in employment, in housing, and poverty. And here I mentioned this report that came from UCLA that did an intersectional analysis of the experiences of Black Latinos using American Community Survey. We had to use 2019 data because of that conflation that I mentioned to you. And I talk about the issue of statistical gaslighting, right? The falsehood that the OMB changes now claim. We're not conflating race. We're just making them co-equal. Really? And then when you claim that the national content test that took place in 2015, nearly a decade ago, is a definitive test on the impact of conflating race and ethnicity and Black Latino counts, is very troubling, right? So here's just a few snapshots, and I'm going to go quickly because I do want to share some of the archival work that we've been working on as a team, looking at how all of these things have been discussed for decades. But anyway, what I want to point out is that you see varying percentages of Afro-Latinos throughout the country, right? So in New York City, where I was born, we have numerically the highest number of Afro-Latinos, but it's only about 10% or 9% of the population. In Boston, there's a higher percentage, but a smaller absolute number, etc. Here's the statistical gaslighting that I'm referring to. If you notice the green part of the map, this is the national content test in 2015 that the census claims is the definitive test on the impact of the combined question on Black Latinos. Well, it turns out that the strata that were green are Latino. None of it took place in the Northeast or where more Black Latinos are located. The Black strata, yes, did include, but not the Latino strata, and that is a problem. The other problem that my colleague, Dr. Yasmine Disari, pointed out is that because of the lack of intersectional analysis, there was no interrogation into who was in these panels when you were testing the combined question or the two separate questions. And what Dr. Irisari discovered is that for the combined panel, it appears that there was significantly more Dominicans there and not in the other questions. So that might have produced results that are very inaccurate. Why? Because Dominicans tend to have higher numbers of people who do identify as Black Latino. So again, intersectional failures, right? That could have been resolved if we had adopted an intersectional lens. Here's just another visual that shows that Panamanians have percentage-wise the highest number of people identifying as Black, followed by Dominicans, but there are more Dominicans in absolute numbers in the United States than Panamanians. But again, intersectional analysis is necessary to make this visible. This just shows that the percentage of population with a BA for Black Latinos is much higher, right? And labor force participation higher, but we have lower incomes. We also have lower home ownership. We also experience higher unemployment. So anti-Blackness affects Afro-Latinos in very similar ways that it affects non-Hispanic Blacks, right? So these are just data showing that. These are two reports that come out of the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute. And I'm going to really speed ahead because now I see I have about 15 minutes left. But this is just an image that shows part of what we are doing as a team. And here I've mentioned this comes from funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And my co-PIs are Dr. Yasmine Irisari and Edward Vargas, but we have a huge team, and I want to shout out Dr. Sharon Mehta, who's our postdoc, as well as other team members, Dr. Sarah Iverson, Ren, Joaquin Arguello, Artilla White, Dr. Ricardo Lowe, Dr. Howard Hogan, Shania Montefiore, and Nakita Rupani. We are doing not only research in the archives, not only interviews, not only quantitative concrete analysis of existing data sets like the census, but we're also doing summer convenings on how to create a community of practice, right, with federal agency leads that include intersectionality and concrete. So what is the history and politics and political context for combining? You know, of course, in 1968, we had the Civil Rights Act. I mentioned that the word color gets dropped. We see a constant dismantling of all of these acts. And of course, the data infrastructure. Every year, there's some kind of bill that is introduced into Congress to reduce or eliminate any kind of data collection, period, never mind the format. In the 1990s, the American Anthropological Association sent a memo to the Office of Management and Budget saying, let's use the combined questions so that we can get rid of this ugly word called race. The American Sociological Association sent another created a guideline that says, no, we absolutely need to collect data on race, but has been silent on the issue since. And again, you know, we see all of these changes. One that I want to also highlight in 2012, up from the 70s until the present, we've had separate committees. Oftentimes they were consisted for Spanish origin, for Black communities, for Asian and Native American. But all of a sudden in 2010, we decided, nope, we don't need that anymore. We simply need one big old national committee with 32 people. Now, mind you, previously there used to be like 21 people in each of those separate committees that would come in and say, you are not going to make a decision until we have all met and made sure that there's going to be no harm. But we don't need that anymore, right? So what has happened? There has been massive mobilization, particularly in the Black Latino community, the Afro-Latino Forum, in anticipation of these changes and since these changes, and a whole coalition of partners that I urge you to visit the website. And also we submitted a letter to the Office of Management and Budget that I urge you to look at that has already been cited, like in the Boston Globe, as the reasons why almost over 100 race and ethnicity scholars have signed saying this is not based on science, right? There's no scientific basis for conflating race and ethnicity. And we actually also created a separate memo that we entered on what is the necessary research that should have taken place before any of these decisions were made. And, what are the possibilities for asking about race as a visual status and ethnicity as cultural heritage, and respecting people's self-identity and adding a street race question. So how do we think of all of these changes? One of the things that we're doing in our research team is thinking about defining this as part of what Charles Mills has called the racial contract, and we are calling the data racial contract. And this phrasing I owe to Joaquin Arguello, who was a student in one of the classes that I was invited to speak at here at the University of New Mexico. And of course, our research team, Iverson, Meta, Arend, etc., as we work through these data, the archival data. And part of it is this effort to not visibilize, right, the experiences, the racialized experiences, and to limit the investigation of any data collection to self-identity, to the exclusion of anything like street race or the social structural reality, the outcomes that are tied to these social statuses. So all of these quotes come from Charles Mills' book, The Racial Contract, that talks about an epistemological contract, an epistemology of ignorance, a cult of forgetfulness, the importance of ontology, the inverted epistemic logic, right? So I urge you all to engage these concepts as we think and try to make sense of why we are where we are right now with data collection at the federal level and beyond, right? We also think about Victor Ray's racialized organization theory and how these minority advisory committees, and Dr. Mehta, who's postdoc on our research team, is leading a paper on this, is looking at how they diminish the agency of these working groups and advisory groups, how there's an unequal distribution of resources, how whiteness is a credential, and how there's this decoupling of the stated aims. Here, this comes again from the archive 1970s. This Interagency Committee on Statistical Methodology recognizes that these adjustments that are going to be made on race and allocation are inseparable, right? That this is touchy because it involves community and Congress. Here, looking back in the 1970s, there were tons of letters and memos by social scientists who come from the Latino community and beyond saying, do not conflate race and ethnicity. We need separate questions. Use two identifiers. So I won't read all of it, but simply saying that there was a long effort to keep these two questions separate, and at the same time that there were efforts to combine. And I want to point out that one of the things that we discovered was some potential unethical translations that may have miscommunicated that tests that were taking place in California in the 1980s in preparation for the 1990s census were saying that it was the actual census. So again, these are all things that raise a lot of questions. Here again, repeated requests for a National Academy studies, and this comes from the chair of the Spanish Origin Committee in the 1970s. That was in elementary school. So we're talking decades, right? On the scientific meaning of race, to look at the procedure on how to determine race. We're still waiting for that study 4 decades later. There has been consensus studies on other things like that race is not genetic, race and genomics. There have been other consensus studies on sexuality and gender, but never on the scientific measurement of race. Is this part of a data racial contract? What is happening? Is this an inverted epistemology? And is there hope that that will change in the future? I remain optimistic. Here, this comes from the Black Advisory Committee chair saying that the census is understating Black Latinos and calls for cross-ethnic solidarity. Here's another quote in the 1980s from the Spanish Origin Committee saying one of the major battles of the 1980 Spanish Origin Advisory Committee with the Census Bureau was with regard to the need for a separate question on Spanish origin as opposed to mixing it with race or nationality. constant reminders that the census has been advised, right, to please consider including other identifiers that make sense for Latinos. So if Hispanics want to report brown on the race question, let them do it. Again, reminding them that we should precede the race question and origin questions with clarifying instructions. But no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to clarify. Absolutely not. And these images come from Chicano Park in San Diego, just again, recognizing that there has been grassroots activists that were constantly trying to make sure that undercount wasn't happening, that that we ground truth this data, a term that my colleague Veronica Velez has written about in our Concrete special issue. I call it, again, statistical gaslighting, and I'm about to end in about 5 minutes, so if I'm going over time, please let me know. When the Census Bureau claims that Hispanics have great difficulty responding to the race question, and that was why they had to do the combined question, and you know, the idea that these new revisions that came out from the Office of Management and Budget says that respondents perceive categories like race or like Latino or MENA as either race and ethnicity. So that requires us, excuse me, you know, like respondents perceive gender and sexuality as the same, so that requires us, or our income and wealth are the same, so that requires us to conflate it. It just doesn't make any sense, right? And then again, I had mentioned how the claim that Afro-Latino counts were higher in the NCT are very troubling, very, very troubling. And the idea that we've requested this data and we haven't received access, many people have, that what I find most troubling is that these recent revisions at the Office of Management and Budget actually say the census forms may not indicate to respondents that they should interpret categories as races or ethnicities. You may not clarify. But again, I remain optimistic. We have to, right? That there's been truth tellers that they actually do say the guidelines don't prohibit agencies from adding additional questions. So the street race question could be added, perceived race, whatever you want to call it. And again, reminder, these changes only apply to federal agencies, not to any of us. So we can do the ethical thing and make the invisible visible. And that finally, there is some traction. The National Academies is finally considering doing a study on perceived race and ethnicity. So we can think about an alternative future, one that actually is challenging the data racial contract and the ontological contests and the inverted epistemologies that have been at play for decades, and that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can ask about your self-identity. Absolutely. No one should be telling you how to identify. We can walk and chew gum and ask a question about your self-identity. Mark all that you want. But we also need that question to understand what are the experiences of people who may identify the same way, but have a different visual status. What is your street race? And again, if you say you're mixed, think about other people who are mixed too, but they're not experiencing that ambiguity, right? I love this quote from Bonilla Silva: anti-racism begins with the understanding the institutional nature of racial matters and accepting that all actors, no one's exempt from racialization. We're all affected materially and ideologically by the racial structure. And this lovely quote that comes from Charles Mills: to the extent that race is assimilated to ethnicity, white supremacy remains unmentioned. And the historic racial contract, prescribed connection between race and personhood, is ignored. And these discussions fail to make that drastic change. So I will end there, and let's see. I would love to end with this slide. How could employing an intersectionality framework as a paradigm shift, as a transformative ethical and normative principle, help create new insights for research, for policy, practice, and distribution of resources? How could we participate and anticipate resistance, right? How could we dismantle this data racial contract? Through interest convergence. OMB actually implicitly acknowledges that race is multidimensional, even though they don't actually say it, but there's lots of references to observed race and knowing that race has a visual component, but no claim that they're going to collect any data on that. And so we can think creatively about strategies of resistance, short-term, long-term, and 10 years from now, how will we know that we've been successful? Thank you so much. I just want to allow, if 1 second remains, announce that we have a book series that I'm co-editing with my colegas, Nicole Garcia and Veronica Velez, and that we will be presenting some of this at these conferences coming up. So thank you so much, and I am very grateful for the opportunity to dialogue.
Thank you so much. Mil gracias. This has just been amazing and incredible. We've just encouraged folks to start posting their questions in the Q&A. So I will lead off with one while people are kind of populating the Q&A box. And we have about 15 minutes for questions. The first one I had was really around what you think. So I was of two minds when I think about, like, you're right, in order to do powerful empirical analysis, we have to have the right data. So when you had to rely on the 2019 data, right, like the ACS, the 5-year estimates, as opposed to the 2020 census, I completely empathized with that. At the same time, do you think that it makes sense for folks who are researchers or doing this kind of work, whether they're students or faculty or just independent researchers, to actually do a side-by-side comparison, right? To say, look at what you get if you use the 5-year estimates, you know, that are predate the 2020 census and now predate the 2024 situation that we have going on here, right? Knowing that that will also come up in 2030. And then here's what you get in 2020, right? You know, I mean, pandemic aside, I would think that that might be a good approach, but I didn't know what you would think about that, to ask the same question and use the different kinds of data to really show the impact.
We're in the process of requesting that data so that we can actually do exactly that. Actually, that was one of the things that we had proposed when we applied for the grant. So to be continued, absolutely, but we would need access to that detailed write-in data. And so we hope there is actually a law that was passed under the current administration about data transparency. So we remain optimistic. And I did mention that Dr. Ricardo Lowe, who's a postdoc at the University of Texas, Austin, has done what we can with what's available and the ACS data and does that side-by-side comparison. But we need the actual write-in for the 2020 census to do that. But yes, absolutely. And we can show, and that again, by fiat, 2 or more became the second largest racial group. And keep in mind, it didn't even combine the questions. It simply added origins to the race option for white and black. And a lot of recoding happened that, again, made it impossible to know if we've made a dent in racialized child poverty and so on, because anyone who wrote an origin that was not concordant with the geographies that people, that the Office of Management and Budget defines as belonging to a racial group was just recoded. And so again, yeah, we plan to do that and to be continued with Dr. Yasmini Risari, Dr. Edward Vargas, and Dr. Ricardo Lowe, we will all be working on that.
Fantastic. Let's do a quick check here of the Q&A box. I don't see any open questions. Well, then I will ask one more, just in case, again, somebody has, oh, there is one. Somebody did put something in. Thank you so much, Professor Dahier. So can you see it, Dr. Lopez? I'm happy not to read it to you if you can see it.
I can't. All I see is your last post from 11:01 my time.
Okay.
I'm not seeing questions. Let me see.
That's okay. I don't mind reading it.
Okay, I think I do now.
The Q&A box.
Challenges of Black immigrants already face due to such limited data. What are the implications of this conflation and recoding for addressing and understanding the unique experiences of Black immigrants coming from the African diaspora? Absolutely. We should have, and if you actually, maybe I'll put it in the chat. If you look at the methods memo that we created that was sent to the Federal Registry, we proposed two separate questions, one that asks about race as a visual status and one that asks about your cultural heritage. And so that way, that would make visible the experiences of African Americans who are the direct descendants of U.S. enslavement versus someone who is coming as an immigrant from anywhere in the globe. It could be Germany, right? So the idea that Germany is an origin that only fits in the white box. I've been to Germany. There are plenty of Black Germans and Germans who would be racialized as East Asian, et cetera, et cetera. So for us to avoid that, we need two separate questions and to make that visible. And it's interesting because I keep saying the census advisory committees pointed that out decades ago. Again, I was in elementary school and none of their advice was heeded. And we're here today because they were essentially dismissed. And I can't tell you how many memos I find where it didn't matter if it was the Spanish Origin Committee or the Black Committee, et cetera. You have never listened to our advice. So how are these racialized organizations claiming that they are including advisory committees for these underrepresented communities, but their advice is not being heeded? And they were dismantled in 2012. And now we just have this huge national advisory committee that's making decisions about communities without that deep grassroots ground truthing, right? It's really appalling.
It looks like there's a question in the chat, and that'll be our last question.
Okay. So for researchers facing the situation, the first thing that I would say is make sure that you are examining what you're getting. I was recently at the American Sociological Association conference in Montreal at a panel with people from the Census Bureau presenting work without really explaining the nuance of how stuff was recoded. So transparency is key, making sure that you are very cautious with what you claim can be done with that data, and that you do precisely what Dr. Hancock mentioned, which is do a side-by-side. So if you're looking at racialized poverty, or you're looking at voting redistricting, or maybe you're looking at housing segregation, and you're saying, oh, segregation is no longer a problem. Well, are you assuming that the way Hispanics were coded in 2010 are the same way that they were coded in 2020? There has to be massive transparency. And I urge you all to consider adopting an intersectional understanding of these measures. Race is not ethnicity, it's not origin, it's not nationality, it's not tribal status. And to practice solidarity, to really think about not doing no harm.
Yeah, I think I'll just ask one quick clarification for folks who have really small numbers in their cells of the intersecting identities. I didn't know if you had specific advice about that as well.
So the paper that we co-authored looking at graduation rates is a perfect example, not reporting any cell size less than 10. Actually, that appears to be the gold standard in the Federal Committee on Statistical methodology that is actually taking place next week. I've been to that conference and I understand that a cell size of 10 is considered the minimum. But also don't get tempted to erase communities. So for instance, when we presented that paper that now has over 300 citations in the last several years, people would tell us, well, Blacks and Asians are too small, don't include them. Well, we were looking at 9 years of data. Also, we didn't report any cell size under 10. So the idea that people will be pushing you to erase groups that are inconvenient because they're too small. That's often used for Black Latinos, saying they're too small, they're only 4%, et cetera. But you may be missing an opportunity to make an inequity visible. So I would say read that paper, but also consider invisibility is doing harm also. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much for this incredible presentation. And so for those on the call and for those who may not have been able to attend, We do record these calls, and we usually put them up on Vimeo, on our Vimeo page. So you'll be able to see the recording or share the recording. And then in the chat, we did put Dr. Lopez's report from UCLA that she co-authored. And I don't know if you have a moment and you can put the graduation rate study, if you have the link easily available. Please do join us on October 31st when we're going to have our next forum series presentation. Maritza, our graduate associate, thank you for putting the link in the chat for you to register. It will again be a purely virtual session. And it's actually going to be, we were talking a lot about ground truthing today. And the next presentation is going to be my colleague Martha Matsuoka from Occidental College, who along with two of her colleagues, Dr. Chad Raphael and Dr. Ryan Pettaway, have created a new book entitled Ground Truths, Community Engaged Research for Environmental Justice. So we again hope that you are able to join us for this incredible conversation. And it is an example, again, of just the kinds of things that we do as part of our land grant mission here at the Kirwan Institute. So Dr. Lopez is putting some things in the chat if you want to download those quickly. We really, really do appreciate you joining. And for those of you who stayed with us to the end, thank you for that as well. Thank you, Dr. Lopez, very much from the bottom of my heart. And I know everyone else.
Well, thank you for all you do, and it is mutual. I'm so grateful for this opportunity, and again, remain optimistic that although these things are happening, that we can create a different intersectional future.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you again. Dr. Lopez, I'm going to have you just stay on the line, but thank you everyone for joining us. And again, we hope to see you again at another Kirwan Forum series.
So has the recording stopped, I'm assuming?